Welcome back to episode 3 of Rebuilding My Dad's Pond. If you've been following along, you'll know that so far we've done all the planning and preparation, got the pond redug, relined, and nearly all of the rock work done. Now we're on to some of the bits that I've been looking forward to the most. This is where it really starts to come together visually. In this episode, we'll be doing the suction grid, creating the bog/wetland/wildlife pond, and the waterfall. Even though most of the rock work's in, the pond still looks very rough and all over the place at this stage. Not exactly inspiring, but once we get through these next 3 jobs, it will start suddenly coming to life and we'll finally be able to get a real sense of how the final result is going to come together. The first of the 3 jobs is the wildlife pond. The pond water will be going from the suction grid into the drum filter, into the biological filter, then into the wildlife pond. The process of making this was extremely similar to how we built the pond. The only difference really being is that we dug a shallow hole and then used the earth to build up the ground around it, to give it just enough elevation so the water level is higher than the pond to make the stream and waterfall work. We first set up the stone that the water would exit the wildlife pond from, and then used that, plus a few inches to be safe, as our height for the level of the water. When we first built this pond almost a decade ago, we thought that we'd have to have the elevation a lot higher than the pond, so it will give the waterfalls a natural slope down for the water. Since building a lot more myself, I have realised that the elevation from the beginning to the end of the waterfall or stream really doesn't need to be that steep at all, and in most cases having just a small drop in elevation from start to finish makes it look a lot more natural and less man-made, especially if the landscape around the area is reasonably flat. Another mistake from the first design with the waterfalls that we made was having a planted area in the middle of the steep part. This made it really difficult and awkward to battle the terrain to weed the middle area without stepping into the waterfall or even falling into the pond. Because of the water going through a drum filter and an upflow static bed filter, this will capture almost all of the physical waste before it gets to the wildlife pond. However, there will over time still be a really small amount that makes it through to the wildlife pond. But because of how small of an amount it is, and how many plants will be in here, essentially breaking down most, if not all of the waste up, I'm not overly bothered about the waste build-up, at least not in any reasonable rate. Because of this, we're simply just having the filter outlet running into the side of the wildlife pond as opposed to using any advanced under-gravel systems. There are snorkel systems that you can use, which some of you may have heard of, which enable slightly more efficient cleaning, but I feel that having a really good mechanical filtration before the bog is probably a much more effective way of preventing any build-up, so you don't really have to clean it much, if not at all. With my dad's setup, he can always manually clean it with a sump pump and a hose or jet wash if he really wants to. In the video of my own pond build, I had various people commenting saying that I wasted my money on filtration because it's not needed simply because I have a bog filter, and a well-made bog filter alone is good enough. Now, in certain circumstances, yes, 100%, a bog filter is all you need providing stocking level is really low, now I'm talking a handful of goldfish, along with minimal or no feeding, along with being able to have a really large bog area as well as a lot of planting. In my case, my plan for my pond was always to have well over 10 koi in there and feed them reasonably heavy, and my bog area is very small because of the space restrictions. All of these things mean that there's absolutely no chance that this system could run entirely off a bog filter alone for the only source of filtration, even if this bog was properly set up as an upflow wetland filter. Planted bogs have become very popular recently for helping to clear up the water and improve parameters, which I think is great, but I think there is a bit of a misconception that the physical waste just magically disappears into thin air. If the waste going through the bog is extremely little for the size of the bog, then yes, the vast amount of bacteria activity may be enough to prevent any reasonable build-up and therefore be considered self-cleaning. But, in my opinion, without pre-filtration, the scale of the bog area versus waste breakdown needs to be a lot higher than people think to truly prevent you ever needing to clean it. Now, I'm not saying most bog filters need to be cleaned every few months, or maybe not even every year, but over time waste will build up and slowly leach into the water column, which is why we are having filtration equipment before the bog to give us the best chance of rarely or maybe even never having to clean the bog. So no, round my pond or on this one, we are not wasting money by buying filters. On this pond, they are still a necessity, even with a bog, even if it was built as an upflow wetland. On to the suction grid. One of the main reasons I went down this route is for the natural aesthetic. The suction grid lets you create that more natural stream bed look with rounded pebbles all along the bottom of the pond. Visually, it just looks a lot more like a natural environment than your typical koi pond with bare walls and drains on show. I have nothing against these styles of ponds. There are many practical reasons why they are better for certain setups, which I'll get onto later. And there are many out there that I find stunning, but that's just not what my dad wants here. A suction grid is essentially a perforated pipe system that sits across the bottom of the pond underneath a layer of round pebbles. The network of perforated pipes in this case are connected to a pump, which creates negative pressure and literally pulls water down through the gaps in between the pebbles. As the water's drawn through, it carries fine debris, fish waste and uneaten food with it, pulling it into the pipework and then off to a filter. Because it's spread out over a wide area rather than just one central drain, you get a gentle, even suction across the whole pond floor, giving you a low level of filtration and a natural looking pond base with no drains, pipes or fittings on show. I first came across these systems thanks to a great pond contractor on YouTube known as the Pond Digger. He's the one who really inspired me to start building these more natural looking ponds and showed that these types of pond builds are possible while still performing extremely well. The pipework here could be a lot closer together and more uniform to help minimise any dead spots, but for this system's requirements it's still going to easily provide enough water flow along the pond floor to help keep it largely clean and provide extra biological filtration. You've probably noticed in these time-lapse videos that we had a bit of an issue with water collecting underneath the liner. So what we did was we dug a deep hole next to the liner, put a sump pump in it and kept pumping out all of the water, and while we were laying all of the pebble, we were making sure to slowly push all of the water towards the sump pump so there'd be nothing trapped underneath the liner. The suction grid can also be utilised in a gravity fed system like in my pond or on an airlift system, but in my opinion, pump fed is better for this setup because you've got actual suction happening here. There's a lot more pull, which helps get waste moving into the filtration system a lot better. With this setup, I can also reverse the pump to back flush the grid if needed, if I'm ever concerned about it clogging up. Now, back in the 90s, this sort of setup was getting really popular amongst ponds, but the problem was blockages. But the issue was that people would use gravel, and over time the small gravel would compact and clog up. Completely different if you were to use round pebble at least 20mm in size like here. However, still to this day, a lot of people still think that suction grids are notorious for blocking up just because they weren't built correctly 30 years ago. So yeah, the big advantage of a suction grid setup is that it gives you this natural, attractive look whilst also acting as a form of filtration, but admittedly it probably isn't the best choice if you're running a koi specialist setup where you're feeding extremely heavy every day, year round, and pushing for maximum growth in really high stocked environments. In those setups you really want to be pulling waste out as fast and as clean as possible, and this type of system just isn't built for that kind of intensity. However, for the other 99% of people who own ponds, I fully believe a properly built suction grid is a great way to give the pond a beautiful, natural aesthetic whilst also not having any plumbing on show. Overall, it's not a system for everyone, but for a natural style pond where aesthetics are almost as important as function, I think it's a great option. Earlier on, when doing the waterfall, we really struggled finding a nice large flat stone that was suitable for the waterfall edge. The best we could find was one that was too deep, so we ended up splitting it. Once we filled up the pond and turned on the waterfall, it looked nice, but we didn't like the fact that you could see the straight cut at the bottom and how high it was from the pond, which made it a lot louder than it needed to be. So a few days later, I went back to reposition some surrounding rocks and lower the centrepiece waterfall stone, which would mean that the straight edge was hidden under the water, and it would also reduce the height the water was falling from, which would reduce the noise. This, in our opinion, made the whole of the waterfall look a lot more natural and a lot less man-made, mainly due to the fact that the main waterfall stone wasn't standing out as much. This small change, we believe, made all the difference. Before we filled up the pond, which took over 18,000 litres, over 4,000 more than the last design, we installed some flexible aeration ventilation or diffuser hose in between the rocks. The aim of this was to achieve similar to my pond, where putting it under the waterfall would 1. Give the water more movement and make the waterfall area seem a lot more turbulent, 2. Help push the surface water even faster towards a skimmer, or in this case intake bay, and 3, which is the most important, for some extra aeration. We were both really happy with the effect that this gave, but in this case, if we're being picky, we probably could have shortened the aeration diffuser so it didn't go quite that far away from the waterfall, but either way, we're happy with how it looks. The great thing about the Hailia air pump, alongside it having a built-in battery that automatically switches on if there's a power outage, is that you can turn the pump up and down to how you like it, so we could get the airflow just right for this without having to mess around with the ventilation valves to reduce the pressure. When the pond was full up, I started testing the water to check for various things such as ammonia and nitrite, but mainly to compare the difference in pH between the pond water and the temporary setup that the fish were staying in. In the week leading up to this, I slowly raised the pH in the temporary setup to slowly adjust them to make the water as similar as possible to the pond that we'd be introducing them into. I did this by adding some sodium bicarbonate. In the last few days leading up to the move, once the pond water was safe, we also started gradually mixing the pond water and the temporary pond setup. This would help minimise any chance of shock to the fish when entering the pond, by making the water as similar as possible. The next video is the final one of the series. We're finally going to be adding fish to the pond, installing the intake bay. I'll also be installing the filtration system and talking through how it all works, plus we'll crack on with the final touches like the edging, planting and landscaping to bring the whole space to life, and then finally revealing the complete finished product. See you on the next one.